Thank the ranking member. Without objection, these opening statements will be made part of the record. I'd like to welcome today's panel. First, Jack Clark, who is the Policy Director of OpenAI, a research and technology company based in San Francisco, and a member of the Center for a New American Securities Task Force on Artificial Intelligence and National Security. Next, David Dorman, a professor and director of Artificial Intelligence, the Artificial Intelligence Institute at the University of Buffalo. Until last year, he was the program manager of DARPA's Media Forensics program. Danielle Citron is a professor of law at the University of Maryland Francis King Carey School of Law, and she has co-authored several notable articles about the potential impacts of deepfakes on national security and democracy. And finally, Mr. Clint Watts, who is Distinguished Research Fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a Senior Fellow at GMF's Alliance for Securing Democracy, and his recent scholarship has addressed social media influence operations. Welcome to all of you, and why don't we start with you, Mr. Clark.
Chairman Schiff, Ranking Member Nunes, and committee members, thank you for the invitation to testify about the national security threats posed by the intersection of AI, fake content, and deep fakes. So what are we talking about when we discuss this subject? Fundamentally, we're talking about digital technologies that make it easier for people to create synthetic media, and that can be video, images, audio, or text. Now, people have been manipulating media for a very long time, as you well know, but things have changed recently. And I think that there are two fundamental reasons for why we're here. One is that the continued advancement of computing capabilities, that is the physical hardware we use to run software on, that's got significantly cheaper and more powerful. And at the same time, software has become increasingly accessible and capable, and some of this software is starting to incorporate AI, which makes it dramatically easier for us to manipulate media. And it allows for a step change in functionality for things like video editing or audio editing, which was previously very difficult. Now, the forces driving cheaper computing and easier to use software are fundamental to the economy and many of the innovations we've had in the last few years. So when we think about AI, one of the confounding factors here is that similar AI technologies used in the production of synthetic media or deepfakes are also likely to be used in valuable scientific research. They're used by scientists to allow people with hearing issues to understand what other people are saying to them, or they're used in molecular assay and other things which may revolutionize medicine. Now, at the same time, these techniques can be used for purposes that justifiably cause unease, like being able to synthesize the sound of someone else's voice, impersonate them on video, and write text in the style they use online. We've also seen researchers develop techniques that combine these things, allowing them to create a virtual person who can say things that they haven't said and appear to do things that they haven't necessarily done. I'm sure that members of the committee are familiar with their run-ins with the media and know just how awkward it can be to have words put in your mouth that you didn't say. So deepfakes take this problem and potentially accelerate it. So how might we approach this challenge? I actually think there are several interventions that we can make, and this will improve the state of things. One is institutional interventions. It may be possible for large-scale technology platforms to try and develop and share tools for the detection of malicious synthetic media at both the individual account level and the platform level. And we could imagine these companies working together privately, as they do today with cybersecurity, where they exchange threat intelligence with each other and with other actors to develop a shared understanding of what this looks like. We can also increase funding. So as mentioned, Dr. David Dorman previously led a DARPA program here. We have existing initiatives that are looking at the detection of these technologies, and I think that it would be judicious to consider expanding that funding further so that we can develop better insights here. I think we can measure this. And what I mean by measurement is that It's great that we're here now, ahead of 2020, but these technologies have been in open development for several years now. And it's possible for us to read research papers, read code, talk to people, and we could have created quantitative metrics for the advance of this technology for several years. And I strongly believe that government should be in the business of measuring and assessing these threats by looking directly at the scientific literature and developing a base of knowledge from which to work out next steps. Being forewarned is forearmed here, and we can do that. I think we also need to do work at the level of norms. So at OpenAI, we've been thinking about different ways to release or talk about the technology that we develop. I think that it's challenging because science runs on openness, and we need to preserve that so that science continues to move forward, but we do need to consider different ways of releasing technology or talking to people about the technology that we're creating ahead of us releasing it. Finally, I think we need comprehensive AI education. None of this works if people don't know what they don't know. And so we need to give people the tools to let them understand that this technology has arrived, and though we may make a variety of interventions to deal with the situation, they need to know that it exists. So as I hope this testimony has made clear, I don't think AI is the cause of this. I think AI is an accelerant to an issue that's been with us for some time. And we do need to take steps here to deal with this problem because the pace of this is challenging. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Dorman.
Thank you. Chairman Schiff, Ranking Member Nunes, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to be here this morning to discuss the challenges of countering media manipulation at scale. For more than 5 centuries, authors have used variations of the phrase seeing is believing. But in just the past half-decade, we've come to realize that that's not longer always true. In late 2013, I was given the opportunity to join DARPA as a program manager and was able to address a variety of challenges facing our military and our intelligence communities. Although I'm no longer a representative of DARPA, I did start the media forensics program, Metaphor, and it was created to address the many technical aspects about the problems that we're talking about today. The general problem of Metaphor is addressing our limited ability to analyze, detect, and address manipulated media that, at the time, was being used by increased frequency by our adversaries. It's clear that our manual processes, despite being carried out by exceptionally competent analysts and personnel in the government, at the time could not deal with the problem at scale that the manipulated content was being created and proliferated. In typical DARPA fashion, the government got ahead of this problem knowing that it was a marathon, not a sprint, and that the program was designed to address both current and evolving manipulation capabilities, not with a single point solution, but with comprehensive approach. What was unexpected, however, was the speed at which this manipulation technology would evolve. In just the past 5 years, we have gone from a new technology that could produce novel results at the time, but nowhere near what could be done manually with basic desktop editing software, to open source software such as deepfakes that can take the manual effort completely out of the equation. Now, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with or evil about the underlying technology that gave rise to the concerns that we're testifying about today. Like basic image and video desktop editors, deepfakes is only a tool. And there are a lot more positive applications of generative networks than there are negative ones. As of today, there are point solutions that can identify deepfakes reliably, but it's only because the focus of those developing the deepfakes-like technology have been on visual deception, not on covering up trace evidence. If history is any indicator, it's only a matter of time before the current detection capabilities will be rendered less effective. In part because some of the same mechanisms that are used to create this content are also used to cover them up. I want to make it clear, however, that combating synthetic and manipulated media at scale is not just a technical challenge. It's a social one as well, as I'm sure others, witnesses will be testifying this morning. And there's no easy solution. And it's likely to get much worse before it gets much better. Yet we have to continue to do what we can. We need to get the tools and the processes in the hands of individuals rather than relying completely on the government or on social media platforms to police content. If individuals can perform a sniff test and the media smells of misuse, they should have ways to verify it or prove it or easily report it. The same tools should be available to the press, to social media sites, to anyone who shares and uses this content, because the truth of the matter is the people that share this stuff are part of the problem, even though they don't know it. We need to continue to work towards being able to apply automated detection and filtering at scale. It's not sufficient to only analyze question content after the fact. We need to be able to apply detection at the front end of the distribution pipeline. And even if we don't take down or prevent manipulated media from appearing, we should provide appropriate warning labels that suggest that this is not real or not authentic or not what it's purported to be. And that's independent of whether this is done and the decisions are made by humans, machines, or a combination. And we need to continue to put pressure on social media to realize that the way that their platforms are being misused is unacceptable. They must do all they can to address today's issues and not allow things to get worse. Let there be no question that this is a race. The better manipulators get, the better detectors need to be. And there's certainly orders of magnitude more manipulators than there are detectors. It's also a race that we may never end. It may never be won, but but it is one where we must close the gap and continue to make it less attractive financially, socially, politically, to propagate false information. Like spam and malware, it is easy and it's always a problem, and it may be the case that we can level the playing field. When the Metaphor program was conceived at DARPA, one thing that kept me up at night was the concern that someday our adversaries would be able to create entire events with minimal effort. These events might include images of scenes from different angles, video content that appears from different devices, and text that's delivered through various medium, providing an overwhelming amount of evidence that an event has occurred, and this could lead to social unrest or retaliation before it gets countered. If the past 5 years are any indication, that someday is not very far in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Citron.
Thank you, Chairman Schiff, Ranking Member Nunez, and the committee for having me here today to talk about the phenomenon of deepfakes, the risks that they pose, and what law can and should do about it. So I'm a professor of law at the University of Maryland School of Law. And there are a few phenomena that come together that make deepfakes, I think, particularly troubling when they're provocative and destructive. The first is that we know that as human beings, the video and audio is so visceral. We tend to believe what our eyes and ears are telling us. And we also tend to believe and tend to share information that confirms our biases. And it's particularly true when that information is novel and negative. So the more salacious, we're more willing to pass it on. And we're seeing deepfakes, or we'll see them, in social networks that are ad-driven. So the entire enterprise is to have us click and share. Right? So when we bring all of these things together, the provocative deepfake, the salacious, will be spread virally. So let me describe, there are so many harms that my co-author, Bobby Chesney, and I have written about, but I'm going to focus on some of the more concrete ones and what law can and should do about it. So there are concrete harms in the here and the now, and especially for individuals. So Rana Ayub is an investigative journalist in India who writes about government corruption and the persecution of religious minorities. And she has long used to getting death threats and rape threats. For her, it's sort of par for the course. But she wrote a provocative piece in April 2018, and what followed was posters circulated over the internet, deepfake sex videos of Rana. So her face was morphed into pornography. And that first day it goes viral. It's on every social media site, WhatsApp, it's on, as she explained to me, millions of phones in India. And the next day, so paired with the deepfake sex video of Rana, was rape threats, her home address, and the suggestion that she was available for sex. Now, the fallout was significant. She had to basically go offline. She couldn't work. Her sense of safety and security was shaken. It upended her life, and she had to withdraw from online platforms for several months. Right? So the economic and the social and the psychological harm is profound. And it's true that in my work on cyberstalking, the phenomenon is going to be increasingly felt by women and minorities and for people from marginalized communities. Now, of course, it's not just individuals. We can imagine the deep fake about sort of the night before an IPO, timed just right, with the CEO saying something that he never said or did, basically admitting to that the company was insolvent, right? And so the deep fake, if the night before the EPO, could upend the IPO, right? The market will respond far faster than we can debunk it. So the question is, and we can imagine all sorts of, and Mr. Watts and I have talked about, I'm going to let him take some of the national security concerns like elections, the tipping of an election, upending public safety. But the next question is, what do we do about it? And I feel like our panel is going to be in heated agreement that there's no silver bullet, right? That we need a combination of law, markets, and really societal resilience to get through this. But law has a modest role to play. There are civil claims that victims of targeted individuals can bring. They can sue for defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, false light, a privacy tort. But the hardest thing is that it's incredibly expensive to sue. And criminal law offers too few levers for us to push. At the state level, there are a handful of criminal defamation laws and impersonation laws. And at the federal level, there is an impersonation of a government official statute, but it's really inapt for the sets of problems that we face today. And so Professor Marianne Franks and I are amidst writing a model statute that we might deploy, one that is narrowly tailored, that would address harmful, false impersonations that would capture some of the harm here. But of course, there are practical hurdles for any legal solution. You have to be able to find the defendant to so prosecute them. And you've got to have jurisdiction over them. And the platforms, the intermediaries, our digital gatekeepers, are immune from liability. So we can't use a legal incentive of liability to get them on the case. So I see my time is running out. I look forward to your questions, and thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Watts.
Chairman Schiff, Ranking Member Nunes, members of the committee, thanks for having me here today. All advanced nations recognize the power of artificial intelligence to revolutionize economies and empower militaries, but those countries with the most advanced AI capabilities and unlimited access to large data troves will gain enormous advantages in information warfare. AI provides purveyors of disinformation the ability to rapidly recon American social media audiences, to identify psychological vulnerabilities, and to create modified content and digital forgeries, advancing false narratives against Americans and American interest. Historically, each advancement in media, from text to speech to video to virtual reality, more deeply engages information consumers, enriching the context of experiences and shaping a user's reality. The falsification of audio and video allows manipulators to dupe audience members in highly convincing ways, provoking emotional responses that can lead to widespread mistrust and, at times, physical mobilizations. False video and audio, once consumed and believed, can be extremely difficult to refute and counter. Moving forward, I estimate Russia as an enduring purveyor of disinformation is and will continue to pursue the acquisition of synthetic media capabilities, employ the outputs against its adversaries around the world. I suspect they'll be joined and outpaced potentially by China. China's artificial intelligence capabilities rival the U.S., are powered by enormous data troves to include vast amounts of information stolen from the U.S., and the country has already shown a propensity to employ synthetic media and television broadcast journalism. These two countries, along with other authoritarian adversaries and their proxies, will likely use deepfakes as part of disinformation campaigns seeking to discredit domestic dissidents and foreign detractors, incite fear and promote conflict inside Western-style democracies, and 3, distort the reality of American audiences and the audiences of America's allies. Deepfake proliferation presents 2 clear dangers. Over the long term, deliberate development of false synthetic media will target U.S. officials, institutions, and democratic processes with an enduring goal of subverting democracy, demoralizing the American constituency. In the near and short term, circulation of deepfakes may incite physical mobilizations under false pretenses, initiating public safety crises and sparking the outbreak of violence. The recent spate of false conspiracies proliferating via WhatsApp in India offer a relevant example of how bogus messages and media can fuel violence. The spread of deepfake capabilities will only increase, and the frequency and intensity of these violent outbreaks will continue. U.S. diplomats and military personnel deployed overseas will be prime targets for deepfake disinformation conspiracies planted by adversaries. U.S. interests in the developing world, where consumption has jumped from analog in-person conversations to social media sharing lacking any form of verification filter, will likely be threatened by bogus synthetic media campaigns. 3 examples would be mobilization at the U.S. Embassy in Cairo, the consulate in Benghazi, and rumors of protests at Incirlik Air Base, had they been accompanied with fake audio or video content, could have been far more damaging in terms of that. I'd also point to a story just out hours ago from the Associated Press, which shows the use of a synthetic picture for what appears to be espionage purposes on LinkedIn, essentially a honeypotting attack. Recent public discussions of deepfake employment heavily focus on foreign adversaries, but the greatest threat of inauthentic content proliferation may come not from abroad, but from a home, and not from nation states, but from the private sector. Thus far, I've focused on authoritarian nation states. I brought a chart here today, but a range of advanced persistent manipulators will use their vast resources to develop and acquire deepfakes as needed in pursuit of their goals. Recent examples of disinformation and misinformation suggest it could be oligarchs, corporations, political action groups, public relation firms, and activists with significant financial support that will seek out these media capabilities and amplify deepfakes in international or domestic contexts. The net effect will be the same: degradation of democratic institutions, elected officials, lowered faith in electoral processes, weakened trust in social media platforms, and potentially sporadic violence by individuals and groups mobilized under false pretenses. I have several recommendations, but I'll only hit a couple here in the oral remarks. First, Congress should implement legislation prohibiting U.S. officials, elected representatives, and agencies from creating and distributing false and manipulated content. The U.S. government must always be the purveyor of facts and truth to its constituents, assuring the effective administration of democracy via productive policy debate from a shared basis of reality. Second, policymakers should work jointly with social media companies to develop standards for content accountability. Third, the U.S. government should partner with private sector to implement digital verification signatures designating the date, time, and physical origination of content. Fourth, social media companies should enhance their labeling of synthetic content across platforms and work as an industry to codify how and when manipulated or fake content should be appropriately marked. Not all synthetic media is nefarious in nature, but information consumers should be able to determine the source of the information and whether it's authentic depiction of people and events. Fifth, and what I think is the most pressing right now, is the U.S. government, from a national security perspective, should maintain intelligence on adversaries' capabilities of deploying deepfake content or the proxies they employ to conduct such information. The Departments of Defense and State should immediately develop response plans for deepfake smear campaigns and deepfake-inspired violent mobilizations overseas in an attempt to mitigate harm to U.S. personnel and interests. And the last, I echo my fellow panelists, is public awareness of deepfakes, and its signatures will greatly assist in tamping down attempts to subvert U.S. democracy and incite violence. I would like to see us help the public make better decisions about the content that they're consuming and how to judge that content. Thank you.
Thank you all. We'll now proceed with questions. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. 2 questions, one for Professor Citron and one for Mr. Watts. Professor, how broad is the immunity that the social media platforms enjoy? And is it time to do away with that immunity so that the platforms are required to maintain a certain standard of care? It seems to me not very practical to think about bringing people to justice who are halfway around the world, or the difficulties of attribution, or the fact that, given the cheap cost of this technology now, just how many people can employ it. Is it time to take that step? Was it appropriate for one social media company to leave up the Pelosi video, even labeling it in a certain way? And Mr. Watts, what's a proportionate response? Should the Russians start to dump deepfakes, release a deepfake of Joe Biden to try to diminish his candidacy? What should the U.S. response be? Should it be a cyber response, not a tit for tat in the sense of doing a deep fake of Putin, but rather some cyber reaction, or are sanctions a better response? How do we deter this kind of foreign meddling, realizing that that is only going to be one part of the problem? Professor?
So I'm going to start with how broad the immunity is, and then that it is time for us to amend Section 230 of the Decency Act. So under law passed in 1996, the Communications Decency Act, it largely was an anti-porn provision. I mean, if we can imagine the internet without porn, that was the objective of the Communications Decency Act. And most of that law is struck down, but what remains is a provision that's good. It's called Good Samaritan blocking and filtering of offensive content. And it's been interpreted really broadly to say that if you under-filter content, if you don't engage in any self-monitoring at all, even if you encourage abuse, that you're immune from liability for user-generated content. So that means that revenge porn operators can gleefully say that they're immune from liability while encouraging people to post their ex's nude photos, and they're right. They are immune from liability because they are not generating, co-creating the content. And so the question is, in a world, and here we are, 25 years later, the internet, we've got dominant players. The internet is not in its infancy, and is it time to reassess it? And I think the answer is yes, that we should condition the immunity. It shouldn't be a free pass, and it should be conditioned on reasonable content moderation practices. Ben Wittes and I have written sort of a sample statute that you could adopt if you so chose, that would condition the immunity on reasonable content practices. Then the question, of course, is, well, in any given case, are platforms making the right choices? And under an approach that would have us look to the reasonableness of content practices, we would look at the platform's total, its approach, generally speaking, to content moderation, not any given decision with content. So let's take the Pelosi video. I think the answer is it should have been taken down. We should have a default rule, platforms should have a default rule, that if we're gonna have impersonations or manipulation that do not reflect what we've done or said, that platforms should, once they figure it out, take it down. The technology is such that we can't detect it yet, right? We can't automatically filter and block. But once we have figured it out, we already are in a place where the public has deep distrust of the institutions at the heart of our democracy. And you have an audience primed to believe things like manipulated video of lawmakers. And I would hate to see, the deep fake where a prominent lawmaker is purported to show taking a bribe that you never took, right? And I hope that platforms come to see themselves, if we can't require them to have legal liability, that they come to see themselves as the purveyors of responsibly of facilitating discourse online and their importance to democracy.
Thank you. Mr. Watt.
Yeah, I'd like to start off with just a basic principle of information warfare. And so R.H. Knapp, who is a professor who essentially studied wartime rumors, his quote was, "Once rumors are current, they have a way of carrying the public with them. The more a rumor is told, the greater its plausibility." And he wrote that in 1944. I think that's still the essential thing. It comes down who's there first and who's there the most. And that's the danger of social media computational propaganda with this AI. In terms of how we deal with this, there's several parts. One is we have to have a plan, and it's a multi-part plan. And the other part is we have to respond quickly. This has not been the tradition of our government. For example, in Iraq, when there would be fake al-Qaeda propaganda put out to try and inspire people to show up places, we had rapid response teams that would show up with video, with audio, that would shoot footage from there to show this is not true, this has been disproven. That's a great example about if this starts to get leaked out, what is our plan right now? The U.S. government, for any government official, government agency, should immediately offer a counter based on fact in terms of what's actually going on. This happened in the summer of 2016 at Incirlik Air Base. There was Russian state-sponsored propaganda put out about a potential coup. Maybe the base was surrounded, maybe there's a protest. We should be able to turn on the cameras at that air base immediately and say, this this is not happening. The faster we do that, the less chance people see it first, the less chance that people see it often and believe it. The second part is, I think it comes down to the political parties, Republican and Democrat. If they have these smears coming through, they should be able to rapidly refute that and put out a basis of truth. This candidate or candidates were not there, but that means partnership also with the social media companies in terms of this. I actually would not go as far as saying every piece of synthetic video that gets loaded up on a social media platform needs to come down. And I'm glad you brought up former Vice President Biden. One of the classic articles about former Vice President Biden comes from The Onion, and it was that he was waxing his Camaro in the driveway of the White House. It was a comedy bit, and it had manipulated photos, manipulated content on it. If we went to that extreme, we would have a country where everything that's ever been changed or modified for any reason would have to be policed, and we'd be asking a private sector company to police that. So I would instead offer a different system, which is triage, which is social media companies, how do they accurately label content as authentic or not? The danger with social media is the source is not necessarily there. We saw that in 2016, we see that today. So they should be able to refer back to whatever the base source is quickly. How do you do that? They should be able to triage. The three areas which I would suggest that they immediately triage in is if they see something spiking in terms of virality, they should immediately put that into a queue and have it done for human review, link to fact checkers, downrate it, not let it go into news feeds, and help the mainstream media also understand what is manipulated content. That's the jump that we're most concerned about. The other part is outbreaks or potential outbreaks of violence and public safety, and then anything related to elected officials or public, institutions should immediately be flagged and pulled down and checked, and then a context be given to it. I see it as the public needs to be given a context that we're not really suppressing all freedom of speech, all development of this context, because there are legitimate reasons that we might want to use synthetic media for entertainment, comedy, all sorts of visualizations that are out there.
I want to go to Mr. Nunes, but at some point I'd love to follow up and see what a proportionate response would be to a foreign adversary that deploys this against us.
I can actually, if you give me 20 seconds, I can tell you what it would be, which is refuting, number one. Number two, I think offensive cyber is in place, and I like what the NSA has actually done in 2018. And then number three, more aggressive responses in terms of sanctions. I like sanctions around troll farms and these cutouts where this content comes from.
Thank you. Mr. Nunes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So how do you put in filters to these tech oligarch companies? There's only a few of them, you know who they are, it's not developed by partisan left wing like it is now, where most of the time it's conservatives who get banned and not Democrats. Like the Pelosi video was taken down, that's fine, I don't have a problem with that, but I can tell you there's videos up of Republicans that go on and on and on. So it's all in who's building the filter, right?
Are you asking someone
Well, you were the one that was talking
Yeah.
about filters, so.
No, and what I was suggesting is that it would be impossible to ex ante filter deepfake content. We really can't detect it as far as the state of the art goes now, nor do I think in the arms race we'll be able to really filter it. And what I was saying is that for something like a video where it's clearly a doctored and an impersonation, not satire, not parody, there are wonderful uses for deepfakes that are art, historical, sort of rejuvenating for people to create them about themselves. So I'm not suggesting all deepfakes, but rather...
No, and I'm not, but I think I mostly agree with you, other than I just don't know how you, I think the challenge here is how do you implement it?
Right.
Which is what you've been studying, it sounds like.
And these are really hard problems of content moderation. I've worked with companies for about 10 years now, in particular on the issue of non-consensual pornography, threats, and stalking, and it's such a contextual question. And so you can't proactively filter, but when it's reported, the question is, and when we see videos going viral, there's a way in which companies should react, and react responsibly. And absolutely should be bipartisan. There shouldn't be ideology that drives the question. But rather, is this a misrepresentation in a defamatory way, right? That we would say it's a falsehood that is harmful to reputation, that's an impersonation, then we should take it down. So I think that is the default I'm imagining for social media companies, but it would be ex post.
But it's a challenge. I mean, you talked about the 96 law that needs to be changed. And I think it has to be one way or another, right? Either they have to truly be an open public square, which then it's very difficult to filter, because then whoever's developing the filter puts their own bias into the filter.
But actually, 1996, that bill, it did not imagine an open public square where private companies couldn't filter. The opposite. It was designed to encourage self-monitoring and to provide an immunity in exchange for good Samaritan filtering and blocking of offensive content. So the entire premise of Section 230 is to encourage and so provide an immunity so that there was filtering and blocking, because Congress knew it would be too hard for Congress or the FTC to get ahead of all this themselves, right? And that was in 96. Imagine now the scale that we face. I think we should preserve the immunity, but condition it on reasonable content moderation practices, so that there are some sites that literally traffic in abuse, that encourage illegality, and they should not enjoy immunity from liability.
Right, but and we're back to where we started. I mean, this is the challenge, right? So how do we draft legislation that would enable that?
Happy to tell you how to do it, right? So Section 230C1 now says, no speaker or publisher or no online service shall be treated as a speaker or publisher of someone else's content. What we can do is change Section 230C1 to say that no online service that engages in reasonable content moderation practices shall be treated as the speaker or publisher of somebody else's content. So we can change Section 230 with some imagination.
It depends on what the definition of reasonable is.
And that's what law does really well, right? So every time I hear a lawyer say we can't figure out what's reasonable, it's called tort law, right? Negligence is built on the foundation of reasonableness. You know, so often law moves in a pendulum, right? We often start with no liability because we really want to protect businesses, and we should. And we experiment, and we realize there's a lot of harm. And then we often overreact and impose strict liability. And then we get somewhere in the middle, right? That's where negligence lives, reasonable practices. And we have industries. There's content moderation has been going on for the past 10 years. And I've been advising Twitter and Facebook all of that time. There is meaningful, reasonable practices that are emerging and have emerged in the last 10 years. So we have a guide. It's not as if this is a new issue in 2019. So we can come up with reasonable practices.
Thank you. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Himes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Dorman, I want to get a quick sense from you of what the status quo is with respect to our ability to detect and where that race is. But before I do that, I just want to highlight something that I think is of actually very immediate and intense interest to the intelligence community. Mr. Watts, you said something which is something's happening on a base somewhere. We can just turn on the cameras. I'm not sure that's right? Because if you can create a deep fake, there's no reason why you can't create a deep fake from that camera to the screen, right? So in other words, the point I'm trying to make is our intelligence community obviously relies on things like full motion video and photographs and that sort of thing. One of the threats here is not just the threats that we might be made to look silly on YouTube, but that our intelligence community, using its own assets, might not be able to tell fact from fiction. Is that correct? When you say, let's just turn on the cameras, I'm not sure that's enough, right?
Well, I think it needs to be, one of my other recommendations was digital verification, which these folks will know better because they're more technically sound than I am on this, but digital verification for date, time, and location of actual content to include real-time content. There's already some blockchain registry solutions that are being developed. That is essential. Part of that would be then if you, as the U.S. government, turn on your cameras, it can be verified by news agencies, reporters. We could have it on C-SPAN. We could use it in a lot of different ways, but we have to make sure that we have the ability to verify that our content is real. So if that sort of an impersonation is done, we can do it quickly and people will know which one to sort through. I'll defer to them in terms of the technical, but some of this is already being developed. It's not quite there yet, but I would want that accompanied with it.
Great, thank you. That actually leads into my question for Dr. Dorman. Dr. Dorman, I understand there's no silver bullet here. This is going to be a cat and mouse game. take a minute or two and just tell us where are we in that cat or mouse game? Should we expect to have undetectable deep fakes out there within a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? Where are we today, and how imminent a challenge is this?
I think there is the risk of having undetectable content that gets modulated shared online. Right now, things like compression, if you have a very low resolution version of a video, the attribution can be destroyed. The camera fingerprint where this content came from can be destroyed. A lot of the trace evidence can be destroyed with very simple types of manipulation on top of the deepfake process, or any type of manipulation. The challenge that we have, though, is that we do have point solutions for a lot of these components, and bringing them together in a useful way, and as I said, getting them in the hands of everyone throughout the pipeline. Imagine if Facebook or YouTube or any of these other companies could have this up front, and when the humans, reviewers, Facebook I think just reported they've hired 30,000 people to review content, could have this ahead of time rather than saying, okay, I have a questioned video or a questioned piece of audio or something that I need to review, now let me go and run this algorithm on it or this set of algorithms. Do that up front so they have a report associated with a particular image or video. And then if there's questions, to put that warning up there. I think the public doesn't know enough about what's possible to demand that if somebody knows something. The truth of the matter is, when this stuff gets shared, it gets created once. And when it gets shared across different platforms. It gets shared by different people with different media. But the truth of the matter is that signature for that particular piece of video, that piece of audio, is there. And so there are tools that the social media companies could use to link those together and make a decision and then share it with everyone. The same way as we do with malware, for example, cyber issues. We've gotten to the point where it's now, we're protecting our front door, and we need to protect our front door from images and video as well.
Thank you, Doctor. Professor Citron, I don't have time to cover this topic, but I just want to express myself on this. The theme of this hearing is how scary deepfakes are, but I got to tell you, one of the more scary things I've heard this morning is your statement that the Pelosi video should have been taken down. There should be this. I don't have a lot of time. Sadly, there won't be a moment, I think, for you to answer, but I do want to have this conversation because as awful as I think we all thought that Pelosi video was, there's got to be a difference if the Russians put that up, which is one thing, versus if Mad Magazine does that as a satire. As you know better than me, we don't have a lot of protections as public figures with respect to defamation. And some of the language you've used here today makes me worry about First Amendment equities, free expression, centuries-long tradition of satirizing people like us who richly deserve being satirized. So anyway, I'm expounding here. I simply just wanted to put that on the record and hope that we have an opportunity this morning to hear more about where that boundary lies and how we can protect a long tradition of freedom of expression. With that, I'll yield back.
Dr. Wenstrup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. I just think, boy, we've come a long way. I remember Chevy Chase playing Gerald Ford on Saturday Night Live, and he didn't even try to pretend to look like Gerald Ford. And then we see Forrest Gump, which was, a wonderful movie, right? It was entertainment. And I remember sitting there thinking, how did they do that? The problem we have, I've always said that out of everything bad, there's a chance to do something good, but out of everything good, there's obviously a chance for people to do something bad. And I think that, we see that. And the way it sounds with where we're headed, it's like we're all living in the Truman Show or something like that, and we got to be careful about that. But I think about, in that vein of out of something good, something bad can happen. I'm sure the Wright brothers, when they learned to fly, didn't think, and maybe we can fly this into a building someday and kill people, right? But that's what happens in this world, unfortunately. But as a result of that, 9/11, for example, it takes a lot longer to get on a plane, and for good reason. And I think that, you know, where we need to be headed might be, and I want your opinions on it, obviously, we got to slow this down. You know, before something just hits it, and I think you're talking about the sort of the triage idea, and maybe we label. Maybe, unfortunately, we have to tell people before they see something, this is satire, it's not real. And you have to, in some way, verify, which is kind of pathetic, but at the same time, that may be what we have to do. Slow it down, triage it. This is not verified, this is satire, and maybe on a global scale, when it comes to punitive measures to people that are doing things nefarious, maybe we have to have international extradition laws. Because when something comes from some other country, maybe even a friendly country, that defames and hurts someone here, maybe we both agree amongst those nations that we'll extradite those people and they can be punished in your country for what they did to one of your citizens. So I'd love your opinion on those, the triage, labeling, and extradition. Whoever wants to take it first.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, one of the reasons that these types of manipulated images and video gain traction is because it's almost instantaneous that they can be shared. They can be shared around the world. They can be shared across platforms. You can see something on one platform and there's a button there to post it to another. There's an old adage that says that a lie can go halfway around the world before the truth can get its shoes on. And that's,
Gosh.
and that's true. You know, personally, I don't see any reason why, you know, broadcast news does it with live types of, you know, they have a delay, 7-second delay or 15-second delay. There's no reason why things have to be instantaneous. We should give, our social media should instill these types of things to delay so that they can get these types of things online. They can decide whether they should label it. We still need to put the pressure on for those types of things. But you know, there's a seriousness issue. There's from satire all the way up through, you know, child pornography. We've done it for child pornography. We've done it for human trafficking. They're serious about those things. This is another area that's a little bit more in the middle, but I think they can make the same effort in these areas to do that type of triage.
Yeah, Ian, if you say what you're about to see is satire and has been modified. So, yeah, go ahead, Jack.
So I think one thing worth stressing is we will continue to be surprised by technological progress in this domain. Because the law of a lot of this stuff is all of these people think they're the Wright brothers, and you know they feel that, and they're all busily creating stuff, and they have figuring out the second order effects of what they build is difficult. So I think that we do need to build infrastructure so that you have some third party measuring the progression of these technologies so you can anticipate the other things in expectation.
Mr. Trans.
And the labeling, I think, is incredibly important. And there are times in which that is the most, that's the perfect, right? You know, rather than second best. That where we should err on the side of inclusion and label it as synthetic and be so required to label it. And it's true that there are some instances, though, where we say where labeling is just not good enough, right? That it is defamatory, right? That people will believe the lie. There's really no counter speech to some falsehoods, right? Some impersonations.
Now, if we get a chance, I'd love to hear back from you on the notion of extradition laws and other punitive measures. Thank you. I yield back. My time is up.
Ms. Sewell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Dr. Dorman, you didn't really answer my colleague's question about how far away are we from actually being able to detect deepfakes. So I know that at DARPA you were working on that. Where are we, either commercially or by government or researchers, to technologically able to detect deepfakes?
So deepfakes is typically referred to as a particular technology that there's certain software out there for doing that. It's not a general concept. So the deepfakes was actually the initial paper that was published that gave rise to this technology came after the start of the Metaphor program, and we did adapt to start looking at those things. There are point solutions out there today. that deepfakes coming from these particular softwares can be detected. And again,
So do we have the soft technology to actually be able to digitally verify the videos, the photographs, et cetera?
the problem is
exist
doing it
today?
at scale. The problem is doing it at scale. If you give me a particular video, I can, with high confidence, I can tell you whether this is a fake video. And I can also come back and say, okay, here are the videos or here are the images that went into it. Because typically it's
How
something
long does
that's-
that take? Is that a matter of an hour, 30 minutes?
with the right hardware and things, you know, it can be done with a constant delay. So yes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes.
So
at
in
most.
advance of the 2020 elections, what can campaigns, political parties, candidates do to prepare for the possibility of deepfake content? Mr. Watts, Professor Centra.
So one thing I think, even here on Capitol Hill and with the political parties, is urge the social media industry to work together to create unified standards. So part of the problem with all of these incidents is if you're a manipulator, domestic or international, and you're making deep fakes, you're going to go to whatever platform allows you to post anything from inauthentic accounts. So if they can't share across accounts, it's like a cancer. They go to wherever the weak point is and it spreads throughout the system to the point where it really can't be policed, even if Facebook or Google or Twitter do a good job. So I think one thing is really pressuring the social media industry to work together, and that goes for extremism, disinformation, political smear campaigns, all things across. What is the standard for policing? And then I think the other thing is having rapid responses to deal with this stuff. Any sort of lag, as much as defense is not the best way, any sort of lag in terms of a response just allows that conspiracy to grow. So the quicker you get out on it, then mainstream media outlets can also work to help refute. Other politicians, other elected officials can help you do that refutation.
Professor, what would you suggest that political parties and candidates do?
I think candidates should have clear policies about deep fakes and a commitment not to use them, not to spread them, and then also to have relationships, establish early on relationships with social media companies so that when a candidate can say, you know what, I wasn't there, wasn't doing or saying that at that particular time, to have an immediate entree to folks at the content moderation, you know, whoever it is at Facebook, whoever it is at Twitter, Microsoft, whoever it is, right, that they have immediate sort of rapid response teams.
How do we even begin to tackle this sort of liar dividend?
Right. Oh, I love that.
In
We're
which,
using my phrase with
I
Bobby
know,
Chesney.
in
Thank
which
you.
politicians are maybe recorded committing an illegal act can deny the truth by claiming that the recording is a deep fake. What do you suggest we do about that conundrum?
Oh, Congresswoman, I love this. That twice we've gotten some play, right, for the liar's dividend, which Bobby Chesney and I conceived in our California Law Review piece. And what most worries us is that sort of in an environment of pervasive deep fakes where, you know, we've acculturated people not to believe their eyes and ears, that, right, the wrongdoer can seize on the fact that can take a genuine recording of mischief and say, that's not me, right? That's a deep fake. And I think so so I have a twofold answer. Part of it is education, right? Part of our robust education that we have to have with the public is telling them about the phenomenon of the liar's dividend, right? So it's not that we shouldn't educate people. You know, so often the response to Bobby and I is, well, do we give up, right? The liar's dividend, do we stop educating? And our response is absolutely not. That it must be a robust part of the learning curve, is to say, look, we know that wrongdoers are going to seize on the deepfake phenomenon to escape reality. And we can't let them do that either. And so we have to somewhere get in the middle from completely believing everything our eyes and ears tell us to being skeptical without being nihilistic, right? Because we do have a marketplace of ideas that's potentially functioning. But when what we are saying is not what we're saying, we don't want to get into that space where we have a non-functioning marketplace of ideas.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, Chairman, and to the witnesses, thank you for being here. It's been a helpful panel, although I have to say that I'm a little bit concerned with some of your suggestions. I think, although in an ideal world they would be helpful, in the real world we live in, I'm afraid some of them are nearly impossible to implement. And some of them have some troubling aspects in themselves, in the sense that it's kind of like fact checkers who aren't really fact checkers. They insert their opinion, and this is just a reality, the challenge we have before us. Sitting on the Intel committee, I'm often asked, in just conversations and casual discussions, what do I think is the greatest threat facing the world? And a couple of years ago, I answered that, and I said, without thinking, I nearly blurted it out. I said, I think it's that no one knows what is real anymore. And as I was driving home that evening, I started thinking on that, and I realized that's true. I think that is the greatest threat facing our nation, where people just don't accept basic truths and basic falsehoods any longer, partly because of their own interests or partly because they just don't understand what is really true. And it's not just deepfakes, by the way. RT television, for example, is extraordinarily good at propaganda that many people just think is perfectly legitimate and perfectly real. Fake news, a term that we've all, unfortunately, have become very familiar with. Their manipulation, as Mr. Himes has indicated, and we can't discuss here, but manipulation of intelligence products is extraordinarily troubling to me. And we live in a world where black is white and white is black, and I could show you evidence that white is black. And a lot of people would believe me that white is black. And I just think that for us to lose that, and by the way, I think we can control governments. I think we can control, to a certain extent, legitimate businesses, but we can't control everyone. And this is going to be so pervasive and so available that virtually anyone could create this. And it's easy to control the U.S. government and say, well, you can't create it, you can't use it for political manipulations or whatever it might be, but you can't control the other 6 billion people on the earth. And that is my concern, just the pure volume of it. It's like trying to monitor every bumblebee that's flying around America. And last thing, and then I'll get to my questions, it goes both ways, and this is my concern as well. We could create the impression that a lie is real, but we could also say that something is real is a lie. To use some of your examples, a politician caught in a bribe, which, by the way, politicians do much worse things than that, but so 1970s, but let's go with that example. A politician is caught in a bribe, and it could be actually true. And he would then say, no, it's just a deep fake. That's not real. And so you lose the credibility in both ways, which now brings me to my question. The first is, and I'll ask them both and get you to respond, with the potential for so much harm, should we have the algorithms that create deepfakes, should they be open source? And if the answer is no, we've got to do that right now. We can't wait for 2 or 3 years to do that because they'll already be pervasive throughout the world. And the second question is, and this is almost rhetorical, but I'd love your answers or thoughts on this. How do we prepare people to live in a world of deception? How do we prepare people to live in a world where they just generally may not know what's real or not? And anyone who would jump on those two, should the algorithms be open source or should we control them?
So yeah, I'll address the first one. We made a conscious decision to make the Metaphor program open. You will see even a week and a half from now in Long Beach at the Computer Vision Pattern Recognition Conference, there'll be a workshop there that's dealing with this. Even though there's potential for our adversaries learning from these things, they're going to learn anyway. We need to get this type of stuff out there. We need to get it into the hands of users. There are companies out there that are starting to take these types of things. So I absolutely think that these types of things need to be open source. There's nothing, it's the same technology that's being used in terms of deep learning to create this type of content.
And I just want to understand, you're saying that it should be open source primarily because they'll get access to it anyway. Is that the essence of your response?
Well, and people need to be able to use it. The more we can use it to educate the community, educate people, give people the tools so that they can make the choices for themselves, that's what we're looking for.
I'll accept that, although with some hesitation, but primarily the first part of the answer, and that is I think they'd get it anyway. What about suggestions, I'm sorry, on how we prepare people to live in a world that just is so steeped in deception? I'm sure you've thought through that, and we have 10 seconds to answer.
So when Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes came up with the notion of the marketplace of ideas, he was a cynic. He wasn't suggesting that truth would always out, and he worried about humanity. But the broader endeavor is at the foundation of our democracy is that we can have a set of accepted truths so we can have real meaningful policy conversations. We can't give up on the project.
Well, I agree with you, and that's our hope. But as I said earlier, that foundation of accepted truths is very shaky at this moment. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Carson.
Thank you, Chairman Schiff. In an era with prevailing distrust of the journalists and the media, do deepfakes risk aggravating this kind of distrust?
So prior to working in AI, I was a professional journalist for 7 or 8 years and finished up working at Bloomberg and Businessweek, so I speak from some experience. Yes, I think that this is a very, very, very severe and potentially undercovered threat, because when you write a story that people don't like, they try and attack you as the author of it, or they try and attack the integrity of the institution, and this makes it trivial to do that and to produce stuff that can convince people that you were not being factually accurate.
So yes, not only do we see the journalists themselves, like Ms. Ayub, being attacked, but what is so corrosive is the notion that the media is going to sit on real evidence for fear that it's a fake. And we've certainly already seen, sort of stings with media organizations. And now they've got to be wary of stings with deep fakes that are really tough to debunk without some legwork, right, with journalistic effort. And so the corrosive effort, what Bobby and I, Chesney and I call trust decay, affects not only politicians and our view of civic and political institutions, right, but everything, right, and centrally so journalism and the media.
If I could just add to that, over time, if an information consumer does not know what to believe, so they can't tell fact from fiction, then they will either believe everything or they will believe nothing at all. If they believe nothing at all, it leads to long-term apathy, and that is destructive for the United States. I think you could look to Russia as an example of what has happened internally to the Russian people and how the Russian government has used the fire hose of falsehoods approach, that if you can't believe anything, you just give up and surrender. The consequences for democracy are political participation, long-term apathy, disappointment in officials that anything can be achieved, not wanting to show up and do things like register or for the draft or show up as an all-volunteer force. I would tell you that would be one I would look at over the next 10 to 15 years. So I think that's the long-term corrosive effect, and if you look at Russia's long-term doctrine of subversion, that's what they're after. They just are much more patient than we are and willing to wait decades for it to come to fruition.
In addition to that, so will technology solutions for authentication be available for even sufficient amounts for journalists or media organizations or fact checkers to keep up with even validating a piece of media before reporting on it, like Chairman Schiff, crowd surfing at South by Southwest or premiering his own Netflix special? How can you verify those things as journalists?
I think it's important to have these tools out there for them. We are not at the case now. As I said, we have point solutions. We don't have a general solution. We don't have a gatekeeper that can be automated completely. This is a cat and a mouse game. As things get better for our being able to deceive visually, they're going to get better, and they're going to move on to covering up their trace evidence. But I think the tools can be put in the hands, and they should be. We had situations where there are embedded reporters where somebody comes up to them with something on a cell phone and shows an atrocity, and they need those tools. They have to know whether to report on that or not. So these manipulations, even before the automated piece of deep fakes, people were doing these types of things, and it's a major concern.
It could even evolve into some kind of new scam where you have someone with a piece of information selling it to TMZ or even a so-called credible media outlet, scamming for $50,000 and the piece is like fake.
It's possible, sure.
Yeah, sure.
If I could add one dimension to this, though, is that how lucky we are to have a very engaged public in terms of actually rebutting things that are false and challenging them. It's not just journalists that are doing it, it's also the public that will challenge back and forth. One of the dangers that we don't think about, though, is in information environments where authoritarians control and eliminate all rebuttals. That can have a very significant backlash to us, which is why I would like to see widespread proliferation of authentication, not just for here in the United States, but on the other side of the world where a regime controls all the information flow and can suppress reality.
worth stating, fact-checking is expensive and time-intensive, and the number of news organizations on the planet who are doing well in economic terms is sort of dwindling over time. And so I think that if we were to go down this path, you need to find a way to fund that, because they, of their own volition, because of the economics, they're not going to naturally adopt this stuff other than a few small trusted institutions.
So it becomes incredibly difficult to remain a credible news source when you're having to pay to fact check constantly.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Crawford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, we've come a long way since Milli Vanilli, haven't we? I just, in the time that we've been here, I pulled up a video that was recently posted. Two British artists teamed with an Israeli company, if I get the name right here, Canny AI. I don't know if you're familiar with them. They created a video of Mark Zuckerberg saying, among other things, he could control the future. And they posted that on Facebook specifically to challenge Facebook. And then Zuckerberg has responded by saying he's not going to take that down. I just wonder if y'all could comment on that. What do you think this is about? And do you think it's a wise decision for Zuckerberg to not take it down, given what we've talked about? And I'll start with you, Professor Citron.
So I think that's a perfect example where, given the context, that's satire and parody. That is really healthy for conversation. And all of these questions are hard, right? Of course, our default presumption as we approach speech online is from a First Amendment perspective, which is we generally, we want to keep government out of calling balls and strikes when it comes to ideas in the marketplace. But private companies can make those kinds of choices, and they have an incredible amount of power. They also have free without any liability, and I think they made the right choice to keep up it was a conversation about essentially the cheap fake of Nancy Pelosi. It seemed to be a conversation about the choices that they made and what does that mean for society. So it was incredibly productive, I think.
It seems correct in this instance, but all of these companies are kind of groping in the dark when it comes to what policies they need overall, because it's a really, really, really hard problem. And so I think what would be helpful is to have a way for them to share policies across multiple companies and to sort of seek standardization, because these judgment calls are very qualitative in nature and they're going to become more numerous over time.
I would just add, though, that while that's a comparison, right, to what happened with, the Congresswoman maybe being inebriated, a video, they were trying to essentially duplicate that. This does point out the idea of context, right? Part of that video, it spread for one purpose only, which was to challenge this rule so we would sort of discuss in this forum, but no one really believes Mark Zuckerberg can control the future, because he surely wouldn't want to show up here to testify or anywhere else or be in the quagmire he's in. How do you know that? I'm trying to make a very serious point about context, which is whenever virality spikes, that's where the assessment, I think, needs to come in terms of triage, and that assessment is when it goes into human curation. So that human curation, okay, we see 4,000 shares in 10 minutes. Now we see 16,000 shares over 15 minutes. That is when it should go, and then we look at labeling, we look at context. How do we inform the public so they make good decisions around it? We had a parallel to this in the analog era. If I was a kid, would show up a newsstand and would say, aliens landed at Area 51. I would ask a mother, friends or family, where does this come from? And they say, oh, that source is just putting out information for entertainment. That didn't really happen. We need to help the consumer make a better decision around that. So I like it that Facebook has been consistent in terms of their enforcement. And I'm also not going to say that they should never change what those terms are. I think they're looking to Capitol Hill to figure out what is it that we want to be policed. What do we want Europe? What does Europe want to be policed? I think they would like to hear from legislators about what falls inside those parameters. The one thing that I do really like that they're doing is inauthentic account creation and inauthentic content generation. They are enforcing that, and they've increased it, and I think that's really, really good in terms of how they've scaled that up. It's not perfect, but it's better.
Let me ask you this. Is there a particular company, or is there a particular region or a particular nation that is especially adept at this technology, that is developing at a quicker rate or or whatever?
It's distributed along the lines you'd expect of prominent research centers in America and China and Europe. So it's distributed wherever you have good AI technologists, you have the capability to create this stuff, which makes it very challenging.
At some point, this will be available off the shelf, though, right? Folks at home will be able to access it as all technology becomes.
It
over
already
time.
is.
Absolutely. That's one of the big differences. You know, you used to have to go out and buy Photoshop or, you know, have some of these desktop editors. Now, you know, a high school student with a good computer, and if they're a gamer, they already have a good GPU card, can download this, can download data, and train this type of thing overnight with software that's open and freely available. So it's not something that you have to be an AI expert to run. A novice can run these types of things.
Thank you. Yield back.
Mr. Quigley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your participation. Following up on those points, the themes here, getting easier to do, the quality is getting better, getting harder to detect. Now, the examples we talk about as victims, democracy, elected officials, corporations, this horrible attack on a journalist, but what about a small business with limited resources? What about individuals who are victims of the example you gave, Professor, of revenge porn, for example? And Doctor, you talked about the scale and widespread authentication. What capabilities might exist as we go forward, either on social media platforms, law enforcement, or for individuals themselves to deal with this detection issue?
Well, I envision some time where, you know, there's a button on every social media piece, or every time you get even a text message with a video attached to it, that you can hit, goes off, it gathers information, not necessarily totally automated. If it's been vetted by one of many other organizations, if you can identify where it came from, so that the individual can make those decisions. The problem is that a lot of these types of technologies exist in the labs, in research, in different organizations. They're not shared, and they're not implemented at scale. So if I want to go out and test a picture, there was a very interesting picture before a tornado up in Maryland a couple of weeks ago. It looked surreal. And I immediately thought, oh, that must have been somewhere else, you know, somewhere in the Midwest, you know, years ago. So I did a search. There's a reverse image search that you can do. After, you know, doing some research, I found that it indeed was real, and it was practically in my backyard. But not everybody has those types of capabilities. Not everybody thinks to do that type of thing. I know that I have relatives that, you know, just do this, and they see something and they want to share it. And so I think the education piece and getting these tools at scale is what we need to we need to work towards.
But the key is, even with detection, for the everyday person who has a deepfake sex video in the Google search of their name, prominently featured, and a platform refuses to take it down, it is their CV. So that even with, meaning it's part of what everyone sees about them. And so it is incredibly destructive. And the same is probably true for the small business. Can't afford reputation.com. If there is a deep fake that really casts us under their business model, right, they may not be able to have it removed, even though it is false and it's an impersonation, and even if it's defamation. We know that the law moves really slowly. They brought a defamation suit, assuming they can find who the creator is. So that's, we're gonna have this, we're in this liminal period where, and it may last years, where individuals will suffer, and it's incredibly hard to talk to victims because there's so little that I can force anyone to do, and we're gonna see a lot of suffering.
And the issues that we just talked about, are you trying to tackle those with your model laws that you were talking about?
Yes, so I am the vice president of the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, and we have been working with lawmakers around the country, both at the state level and the federal level, both in terms of non-consensual pornography and now to think about how we might really carefully and narrowly craft a law that would ban deepfakes or manufactured video that are essentially impersonations that amount to criminal defamation. So I think we've got work ahead of us at CCRI and laws around the country. It can be tackled, but it's going to have a really modest impact because law moves slowly.
And when you're doing this, are you talking to local and state law enforcement agencies?
Yes. So in my work on cyberstalking, I wrote a book called Hate Crimes in Cyberspace, which was about the phenomenon of cyberstalking and how hard it is to teach local law enforcement both about the technology and the laws themselves. You know, they're great at street crimes, but when you talk to them about online crimes, even though they're offline components, they say, I don't really know where to begin. I don't know how to get a warrant for an online service provider, to get an IP address, to go to the ISP. So we do have some education. I know Congresswoman Clark has called for funding, some training of local law enforcement on the question of cyberstalking, both as a technical matter and then as to law. And I'd love to see that not only with regard to cyberstalking and threats, but more broadly.
Thank you all.
Mr. Hurt. Yes, Mr. Hurt, sorry.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm going to try to do something that's probably impossible in the next 5 minutes, touch on and get y'all's perspective on 4 areas. The ability to detect. We've touched on, Mr. Doorman, you touched on authentication as a strategy for this. How do we develop a strategy in a narrow national security sense to counter disinformation and who should be doing that? And then broadly, education. And my first question is probably to you, Mr. Clark and Dr. Doorman. Can you talk to us about the ability to detect and the forensics? Like, is there ability to do a pixel-by-pixel analysis, a bit-by-bit analysis? Is there other areas of basic research that we should be focusing on in order for us to help with an ability to detect?
Well, the approach that's being taken in the community is one of a comprehensive view. So yes, there are pixel types of applications, not necessarily pixel by pixel, but the metadata that you get on an image, you know what compression algorithms that were there. You know that there are residual information left if you take an image, you modify it, and you recompress it. So at the digital level, that's where a majority of the work is being done, and that's
how easy is that now, and who should potentially be doing that?
Well, the government is putting a lot of money into this piece. As I said, there's a lot more manipulators than there are detectors. I would hope that behind closed doors that the social media sites and the YouTubes of the world are looking into this type of application, but I'm not sure.
Is the ability to understand the various metadata, or even getting to a point where we can do pixel by pixel, exploration in mass, is that going to help us in a point where you can do, real authentication? So anytime you put a video up or a picture up, there's a green check mark. Is that
personally, I don't like to use the word authentication because, as we know, absolutely everything that goes up online is modified in some way, whether it's cropped or, there's a color histogram distribution
what word
adjustment,
would you use?
but it's not things. Well, we like to use that things have been modified, but it's a scale. So if there's a modification of intent, if you put a flower in a picture next to someone, that has a very different effect than if you replace somebody's face in a picture. And so this discussion, this attribution piece, and the actual report that says this is exactly what was done was a big part of the Metaphor program as well.
So the closest you're going to get is say all of these things happen to this image, and therefore the user would have to be the one to make the decision on whether this is credible or not.
Yes, and even in an automated way, if you are taking an image and you're the FBI and you're going to court, even if you did change 1 pixel, you lose the credibility. Gotcha. But if you're doing an FBI and you're doing an investigation and you have a very compressed, grainy surveillance video, it still might give you information, you believe it.
Ms. Citron, and then maybe Mr. Watts, Disinformation is a subsection of covert action. Covert action and counter-covert action is the responsibility of the Central Intelligence Agency. Yet the Central Intelligence Agency, because of the National Security Act of 47, can't do covert action in the United States of America. Very hard to do it in English. How should we be looking at a government strategy to deal with disinformation, especially in the context of national security? Or is somebody else more appropriate to start with that?
I think it's two parts. I would encourage the social media industry and the platforms to focus on methods. Who's doing deepfakes, digital forgeries? Who's doing computational propaganda? Can we have a listing of those? They're not always nefarious, but then we know who the people are that are building the equipment. This is essentially the weapons that are being used. And I would encourage the government then to focus on actors. So this is in the case of the CIA oversees DHS in terms of protecting the homeland, who are, State Department, which used to have the U.S. Information Agency, would be out there outing and overtly going after those actors that are doing the manipulation. I feel like we are still, after several years now, really slow to do this. And they're the only ones that can figure it out. When I have worked with social media teams and we spot actors that we believe are doing things, we sometimes have to wait years for the government to go, yes, here's the Mueller report, and it labels the Internet Research Agency. But that had already been out in the news. So the more rapidly the government can do that, the more the public can help, the more the social media companies know what to take down, because that attribution really only comes down to the U.S. government. They're the only ones with the tools, really, that can do that.
Good copy. Thank you. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Heck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, Professor Citron, I want to make sure that I understood correctly. If something like happened to that reporter in India had happened in America, did I understand correctly that that would not constitute a crime per se?
It might be understood as cyberstalking, which is a crime under federal and most states' laws. The problem is it was sort of like death by 1,000 cuts, and to constitute cyberstalking, you need a course of conduct, a persistent repetition by the same person.
So if it were the first time?
If it were and what happens is it's like a cyber mob coming together. So one person puts up the photo, a screenshot. Another person puts up the home address. Yet another person puts up, I'm available. Just all it says is I'm available with a screenshot.
So the person who originated it, under current law, would likely not be subject to criminal prosecution.
Right.
Did I also understand you to say that even if it were, it would have modest impact?
That is, what I said was, if we had criminal laws that combated the sort of deep fake phenomenon and really tailored to falsehoods, impersonations that create cognizable harm, I think law is really important. It's not that it's modest in the overall impact, because we need a partnership with technologists,
I'm
right?
sorry. I want to move on, but I also cannot help but have this terrible flash of Dante's Inferno. Abandon hope, all ye who enter here. Whose job should it be to label? That wasn't clear. I kind of thought it might be the media platform companies.
I think it would be the creator, that we could, much as we do in the campaign finance space, where we say there's certain disclosure rules that we say if it's a political ad, you have to own it.
So if it's a foreign originator, how is it that we have any jurisdictional reach? And
well, we don't.
I mean, there are no boundaries, right? And so as a matter of practical fact, even if it's created in America, transmitted to a foreign person, and then retransmitted, we have no means of enforcement. Right. So labeling in and of itself.
And that might be a reasonable
remarks above
practice.
About Dante's Inferno?
But look, we've got social media platforms. If they had some responsibility, they may, and if indeed, and I'm pretty skeptical about whether we're going to get there in the near future about the technology of detection, but assuming that's possible, then a reasonable practice could be a disclosure saying this is a fake.
So
do with it what you will.
We actually have as it were, a comparable truth verification mechanism currently, Snopes. And yet, a member of my family, who shall go unnamed, immediate family, once posted how outrageous it was and how the Constitution ought to be amended because members of Congress can retire after one term, immediately collect full pension benefits. Every member up here has heard this. Have health care free for life, and their children go to college for free. Not one word, not one letter of that assertion is true, which could have easily been verified if they had gone to Snopes. They didn't. And even if they did, in a political context, the truth is the person who's perpetuating that may have a political agenda such that they also, in a parallel fashion, engage in ad hominem, as it were, attacks against the reliability of Snopes. So, see remarks above, abandon hope all ye who enter here. I don't have much time left, but I'm really interested in Mr. Himes getting at the issue of political speech and First Amendment. You mentioned that, you know, we are protected against being impersonated, but it's not clear to me how we square case law, which has created a very high barrier.
And it's incredibly important to recognize that everything you've just described is totally protected speech. You know, the United States has made clear in a case called United States versus Alvarez, a plurality in occurrences of the court, said that, look, we protect falsehoods, that we're going to ensure it enjoys First Amendment protection because, as Justice Kennedy explained, it reawakens the conscience. It has us engage in counter speech and sort of recommit to citizenship. But there are times, as the court made clear, that when falsehoods create certain kinds of cognizable harm, that we can and should regulate. And that includes defamation, even of public officials, if said with actual malice, that you know or you're reckless as the truth of the matter asserted, right? So there are true threats, incitement. There's 21 crimes made up of speech. We can regulate certain words and images if it falls in one of those categories or if we can meet strict scrutiny. So yes, the presumption is that it's protected speech if it's a falsehood. But falsehood that causes cognizable harm, the court has explicitly said, actually it's the entire court, has said that that is a space that we allow regulation.
Thank you.
Mr. Welch.
Thank you very much. You know, this is very helpful. There's different categories, and we're all trying to get our arms around them. There's the question of the First Amendment, which Mr. Heck and Mr. Himes were talking about. There's the question of foreign interference, and there's the question of economic harm, reputational harm. And the environment, and we're all learning as we go on this, but what I've heard you be describing is essentially the whole world of publishing is upside down. It doesn't exist like it did prior to the internet. So the question is whether we want to get back to some of the principles that applied pre-social media. It's not like those principles necessarily have to be abandoned, they have to be applied. And they would apply in different ways for each of those different categories. I just want to ask each of you whether we should get back to the requirement of an editorial function and a reasonable standard of care by treating these platforms as publishers. And I know, Ms. Citron, you said yes. I'd be interested in what the others see, just yes or no on that.
So working with a number of people sort of in this area, I think the horse has sort of left the gate on this. I don't think we're going to be able to get back to that type of
well, what about with that
editorial
statutory change that Ms. Citron was proposing? Let me just go on a little bit, because who has the duty
May I be clear for 1 second?
Yeah.
It wasn't that I was suggesting that social media platforms be understood as publishers strictly liable, but rather that we condition their immunity on reasonable practices.
Right.
Those reasonable practices may be the content moderation practices they use right now. So I'm going to disagree about calling them publishers who would be strictly liable for defamation. That's not what I'm
I
suggesting
see.
at all.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. But that seems to be one fundamental question that we would have to ask, because that would be a legislative action. Mr. Clark?
I think you have a whack-a-mole issue here, where people sort of online go and talk and they compose their own platforms very, very quickly, and they compose platforms to evade rules that we put against platforms doing certain types of things. So I do agree with Dr. David Dorman here that it's very difficult to contemplate controlling speech in this way, because I think the habit of the entire culture of people has changed. So
Well,
people
but
want
what
to
about
do
on this
things.
question of somebody going online and putting up a fake video that destroys an IPO? I mean, who has a duty of care with respect to allowing that to be stated on their platform? Nobody has it?
I think that we can authenticate content and users, and I think that you can make users culpable for certain types of content that they post.
So who would be liable in the case of that false statement about an IPO that destroyed its value?
I will defer to the lawyer.
The speaker, the creator of the deepfake. And so long as Mr. Clark suggested, the platform had reasonable practices of authentication and sort of ex
But if
post
they
moderation
didn't,
practices.
But does the platform, under current law, have any duty?
They have no liability under Section 230 of the
Right, so
Decency
that
Act.
seems like a very direct question.
Right.
And one of the other issues that is debated, there's a different point of view often between Republicans and Democrats about bias and what goes on in the platforms. So there would have to be some standard that wasn't seen as tilting the playing field for Republicans or Democrats. Is that possible to do? And was that something that was true pre-social media in the days of...
You're the journalist,
Go ahead.
don't you think? Jack? Yeah.
I was going to say that for standards, we can actually use technology a bit here to create technological standards for making a judgment call as to whether something is or is not faked or synthetic. And that might take the political aspect out of this if you have open standards developed primarily by academia, the companies chime in on, and it's auditable by scientists who kick the tires and provide assurance. It seems reasonable.
Okay. Thank you all very much. My time is up. I yield back.
Ms. Demings.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of you for being here. You know, this conversation this morning has been pretty disturbing and actually quite scary. You know, when I think about it, the internet is the new weapon of choice. And as I listen to the testimony and the questions here, you know, as we think about an individual who goes out and violates laws or creates harm would be held accountable, I believe that any individual or entity that bullies or stalks or creates harm or a public safety, becomes a public safety risk, any entity that creates an environment for those things to happen should be held accountable as well. And you know, when I think about those around the world who are not our allies, they want to create chaos in this country. And what a wonderful way, an easy way to be able to do that. The problem that, you know, of course, the fake information is a problem. But the other problem is it creates an environment where good people no longer believe the good guys. And boy, are we seeing that in our country right now. That's a major problem. Our institutions that we have grown to depend on and believe in are no longer being believed. And that can create total chaos. Back to Mr. Heck's statement about, say, for example, a fake video is being created, is created in America, but then transmitted to another country. Could not the act of transmitting, the simple act of transmitting that video be the violation? Because I know there's been a lot of discussion about there are no boundaries. How do you hold someone in a foreign land accountable? But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
So I think there are two pieces to that. There's the sort of procedural jurisdictional question of whether it's constitutional to haul them into your court, it's personal jurisdiction. And then there's the extradition question, which I'm going to rely on, I think, Mr. Watts for that. But
if you're in America and you transmit a video that creates a public safety concern or a national security risk, could not the very act of transmitting it from America be the violation?
Well, and
as
so
we
you're
talk
asking,
about
so
policy.
it's directed outside the United States. So you're in the United States and you
Directed outside.
and you
transmit it from
so that's
Florida.
That was a different question than I thought you were asking, because when we, under the 14th Amendment, how we think about personal jurisdiction is that we say if you're aiming your activity and you're aiming a tort to another state, and you're doing it purposefully, you're availing yourself of that state, we can haul you into court, so long as there's a long-arm statute. But now, you can tell I teach civil procedure, but now we've confused me a little, because then the question is, when it's an American directing harmful activity abroad, I would imagine that then is contingent on that country's jurisdictional rules and our extradition arrangements and treaties with them, right? So, Mr. Watts, you want to take it from there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a lawyer and I try to avoid them, but I would generally say that there is no specific provision around transmitting that abroad. I think it comes down to whatever country it is that is affected by it, if it breaks their laws, and then if they have an extradition relationship with the United States. That is probably not worked out. I'm not sure if it's ever been executed. It could have, and I'm not aware of it. But it is something that needs to be addressed, because what has been very clear over the last 4 years is there is no physical boundary in these communities and these disinformation networks online. And they oftentimes, the smartest manipulators out there, Russia, China, Iran, they actually look to enlist people in foreign lands to make the content look more authentic. Exactly. And they're setting people up. Sometimes they're aware of it, and sometimes they're not aware of it. Those that are aware of it are doing it willingly. And so if you look at the Macron leaks, for example, which was another hacking attempt trying to drive an election, it was actually someone in North America that alerted the world to it, right, and pointed the direction to it. So I do think we need to figure out what those relationships and how we would handle it in terms of our own law enforcement environment, because we are now going out to other countries and asking them to do that for us.
Thank you. And back to, I know we've talked quite a bit too about the intelligence community and our national security entities. But could you talk just a little bit about how should we task the intelligence communities and our national security entities with assessing and forecasting future impacts of deep state technology?
I think there's two parts. One, who are the purveyors and actors that are going to use that? That's pretty straightforward. I mean, from the outside, even where I work, I can see a lot of that. I think the part that might be missing from the government's perspective is where those technologies being developed. The number one place I would have someone as a liaison in the U.S. government right now is Tel Aviv. I mean, this has been a central hub of everything from cyber tools to influence tools, influence operations, both good and bad, you know, depending on what your perspective is, but that is a tech hub. I feel like oftentimes when I talk to the government about that, they're really well informed about what deep nation-state actors are doing, but oftentimes missing what the private sector is openly available in terms of AI and other tools that are out there.
Okay. Yes, Mr. Clark.
Just
Mr.
quickly
Chairman, can you respond quickly?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, just quickly to this point, it's worth repeating that the fundamental techniques and tools for this are published openly online, and we can easily compile quantitative metrics for the rate of improvement, so we can do that forecasting. So I agree with what Mr. Watts said, but it is easy to go and discover this information for ourselves.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Dr. Wenstrup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ms. Demings, because you addressed the question that we ran out of time on the extradition laws. I appreciate having the opportunity to hear from you on that. You know, just getting to other punitive measures that we may be able to start talking about and thinking about. You know, with the extradition laws, though, we might end up with a lot of people hanging out in other people's embassies for many, many years, and rather than being extradited. But at the same time, well, as a doctor, I don't often find myself eager to engage with trial lawyers. But that's probably where we need to head with this, as you know, people are harmed through all this. So, you know, I'm going through my mind what kind of punitive measures. You know, certainly monetary would be included, because people end up, as we pointed out, with huge monetary losses because of these fake stories. And what about prison time? I mean, I think we really need to consider being pretty tough on this if it's to be effective.
One thing I would add that Chairman Schiff brought up, and I kind of ran out of time in the opening questions, was about sanctions. What we did see, if you look at the GRU indictment in particular, which I think is July of 18, they're essentially being sanctioned or outed, and so are those companies in the February 18 troll farm indictment. That's very effective, but you could move down the chain of command such that hackers and influencers, propagandists, don't want to be hired at those firms because they know the risk that they could be individually sanctioned. I think that could be an effective technique. It seems like it would be hard to execute, but once we got good at it, I think it would be a great facet, which is if you can turn down the employment to where the best hackers and the best propagandists don't want to work with those authoritarian regimes, it could change the nature of things. I think we could also look at those that are pushing out tools, and both in terms of cyber and hacking tools that are being used for very malicious purposes and for influence techniques. You could actually go after those companies, which are oftentimes international. They're not necessarily tied to a nation state, and that would also send a downward pressure, you know, across the disinformation space. It would also send it more undercover and places like the dark web, but that's okay because that plays to our strengths, which is we have great intelligence collection capabilities at that end, and we have good, sophisticated intelligence agencies.
Yeah, now we would know where it is, you know,
right?
More likely, but it would be a black market.
It changes the problem, but I think to our advantage, we're moving in the right direction.
Well, the other thing too is, you know, you mentioned sanctions, and that does make a lot of sense, especially if it's a country that there's no way you're going to get some type of extradition agreement, you know, in place, right?
Right, and I think that's the case with most of these locations, whether it's China, Iran, or Russia. Those are the three big ones. But it also would send a message out across the world. If you're pushing on us, there are options that we have. I do think that the time for offensive cyber is at hand, and General Nakasone, I think, has done some very good briefings recently about that, talking about the measures that are taking. If these foreign manipulators, makers of deep fakes that are working at troll farms, cyber hackers knew that we were actually going to respond in a very aggressive way, they would move away, whether it's arrest and extradition, if it's sanctions individually, or even in terms of cyber response.
Yeah, right now there's not a whole lot of deterrence.
No, it's proliferated because we have not responded.
Yeah. Thank you. I yield back, unless someone else wants to comment, but I appreciate it. Thank you for the time.
Thank you. I just had a few follow-up questions. Can you talk a little bit about the... Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Chairman. Professor Citron, first, I enjoyed your article with Bobby Chesney out of UT Austin and had a chance to visit with him on some of these issues a few months back. And you mentioned the case about falsehoods, and I think this will be a monumental task for the legislative branch and then the judicial branch to grapple with how we treat deepfakes. There's some speech like hate speech and fighting words that are not as protected, obviously, as political speech. And in making that determination, we have to figure out what the value is of the type of speech or expression. So let me ask you, what is the value of a fake?
And just to add to that, and thank you so much for reading our piece, is the value to the listeners, right? So when we think about free speech theory, it's the value to the autonomy rights of the speaker and for self-governance.
The creator in this
right?
case.
The creator, but also, of course, the listeners.
Sure.
And so the value of the fake could be profound, right? It could be that the deep fake contributes to art. You know, Star Wars, we had Carrie Fisher coming back, right? There's a lot of value in deep fakes. At the same, so I recognize what my co-panelists are suggesting, but we do have guides in the law about falsehoods, impersonations, so that that cause harm, whether it's defamation law, or it's another kind of speech where we say fraud.
Right, so you think we may go down the road, or the court eventually may go down the road where certain speech, like hate speech, is not protected obviously in the same way as political speech or even ordinary speech?
I think we're going to stay firm on hate speech. I have a feeling, and
No, but I mean
think
for
we
fakes.
ought to.
That there will be fakes, certain fakes that are treated differently than other fakes.
Depending on the context. All of this is so contextual. So I don't think we can have a one-size-fits-all rule for synthetic video, even as to impersonations, because you could have satire and parody, which is really valuable and important. At the same time, we've got to bring context to the fore and say there are times when these falsehoods, the deep fake, causes real harm that is cognizable, and real harm that either doesn't enjoy First Amendment protection or enjoys less rigorous protection, and we can regulate it.
Let me follow up. I wanted to ask y'all, one of the big challenges that we had with the Russian interference, particularly what they put on Facebook and social media, is that it seemed as though the social media companies were unprepared for that, and there was no infrastructure for vetting or moderating those things. So, just my rough sketch, obviously y'all have thought about this a lot longer, but I see that there's a creator who uses software who then posts on social media, and then the traditional media picks it up and then further proliferates it into the bloodstream of American society. So where in there do we construct that infrastructure for vetting and for moderating these deepfakes? Who is responsible at each of those levels?
Well, again, I'm not the lawyer or the policymaker, but I think there's another piece to that puzzle. Somebody puts something up that's innocent and it gets used by someone else for a different message. So this is almost not even the deep fakes problem, but something that gets put out there and then gets twisted in a certain way somewhere down the line, way after.
There's a lot of people that don't realize sometimes that the Onion articles are actually satire.
Exactly. That's a good example of that. So I think we need these types of things at every level, that we need to be able to show the attribution of this information, how it progressed, and be able to make those decisions at every level.
I would add, I think that scenario is exactly what will happen going into future elections by our foreign adversaries, which will be to use as much organic American content that suits their narrative and to amplify that and inject it back. That's a pretty standard disinformation approach, and especially as false content is proliferating, there are more people are able to make it each year. They can make fake content. That means that it's more available for our adversaries to repurpose and reuse, which is the scenario that David just talked about. So I think the social media companies need to work in terms of virality. What are their thresholds for doing assessments, how they do their content labeling, and then even a triage within that in terms of severity of impact. We know what some of those are, right? Like mobilization to violence, talking to violence, but also in terms of effect to democracies and political institutions, things related to elections. Right now, I would be very worried about someone making a fake video about electoral systems being out or broken down on Election Day 2020.
Sure.
We should already be building a battle drill, a response plan about how we would handle that in the government, in the state governments and the DHS, as well as with the social media companies.
Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a few follow-up questions. I don't know if any of you know to date how many millions of views the doctored video of Speaker Pelosi has received, but I wonder if you have a sense of if there are X million views of that video, how many of those millions will ultimately learn that that video was a fake, and how many will be permanently misled? And then what's more, if you could comment on the phenomena that even if you're later persuaded that what you have seen of the person is not true, I understand that psychologists will tell you that you never completely lose the lingering negative impression you have of the person. So I wonder if you could comment on those two issues.
Fact checks and clarifications tend not to travel nearly as far as the initial news, so we would expect the same to hold here, whether people who have seen the doctored video, tiny minority will be aware that it was doctored, will be the assumption.
So the assumption will be, if you put this out, that a very small minority will actually learn that it's a fake, no matter how good you or the press do of putting that out there, because the truth in this case, that what you've seen is false, is not going to be as visually impacting, may not be visual at all, as seeing the video?
Yeah, but the way I'd quickly put it is, if you care about clarifications and fact checks, but if you're just passively enjoying media, you enjoy media. And so the experience of speaker fake is you enjoy or experience that media, and an absolute minority care about whether that's true beyond the entertainment value you extracted from it. It's just a general thing.
You know, what should, you know, I don't know whether it's journalism or whatnot, what should teachers in schools be educating young people about these days, about whether you can believe what you see? You know, this gets to the liar's dividend. And by the way, you know, in politics, there's a saying that the first time you hear an expression or an anecdote or a story, you make personal attribution. The second time you say, somebody once said, and the third time it's pretty much yours. So liar's dividend is now out there. But, you know, how do we educate young people, or not so young people, about how to perceive media now without encouraging them to distrust everything, in which case there is this liar's dividend?
It's true that the more that what we're seeing, even if it's totally false, confirms our worldview, social psychology studies show that we are just going to ignore it, so that we will believe the lie if it's confirmation bias theory. So you're right that it becomes incredibly hard for the fakery to be debunked because it's so video, and because if it confirms your worldview, it's really tough. I guess that's the task of, as parents, as educators, that as teachers, as we talk to our students, 10 years ago, remember, the critical thinking was about how do we teach students how to do a Google search? And what can they believe everything that's in the prominent in a search in whatever they're doing? And we saw that, you did a search for the term Jew. What would come up first was a virulently anti-Semitic site called Jew Watch. And teachers struggled to
for regional peace and security situations, and implementing agreed solutions, agreements, and framework. Since the start of cooperation between...
Explain to students that just because it's prominent doesn't mean it's real, right? Doesn't mean that it's the authority. And I think we're going to have the same struggle today, right? That
the UN Security Council and the AUPSC were found that the relationship between the two councils have been meaningful as well as useful.
Yes, we're going to teach them about deepfakes, and I think we've also got to teach them about the misuse of the phenomenon to avoid an escape.
In finding common grounds and peace and security issues in the African continent. So therefore, wholly supports the improved
responsibility.
Well, I mean, the other challenge too is we have a White House that has popularized the term fake to describe lots of things.
An increased cooperation between the United Nations and the League of Arab States, as this is pertinent in dealing with the conflicts in the Arab region.
In fact, some of the most trusted news sources in the country. So there's already an environment in which there's licensing.
That will cooperate the efforts of the League of Arab States in promoting peace in the Middle East region, especially efforts furthering
fake that are true but are critical. And it seems that that's a pretty fertile ground for
this peace process, the oldest peace and security item on the agenda of the Council. It is therefore vital that the UN strengthened
for the proliferation of information that is truly fake. I mean, we find ourselves, frankly, trying to find other words for it, false, fraudulent, because fake now has been so debased as a term. People don't know really what you mean by it.
I think it's worth noting, too, that when...
An engagement with the League of Arab States. In this regard, South Africa welcomes the appointment of Khalid Ahmed.
President Trump referred to the Access Hollywood tape, he said, well, that never really happened. The Holtz interview, oh, that wasn't right. We've already seen the liar's dividend happen in practice from the highest of the bully pulpits. So I think we've got a real problem on our hands.
Do you think there's some optimism for tools? I've been involved in numerous arguments with friends where we've gone and checked, though it's imperfect, something like Wikipedia, or you end up using the information sources around you, and you can train people that there are certain sources you can go to settle an argument, as it were. And I think that we can develop such tools for some of this technology.
And I think that that's a great motivation for having this this information up front. When Mr. Heck was saying that he had a family member that didn't know about going to Snopes, if that information was attached to the video or the email or whatever ahead of time, they would have had access to it and they wouldn't have had to go search for it.
Well, I'm just thinking of the, applying in 2020 what we saw in 2016. And in 2016, among other things, the Russians mimicked Black Lives Matter to push out content to racially divide people. And you can imagine foreign bad actors, particularly Russia, dividing us by pushing out fake videos of police violence on people of color. And we have plenty of really authentic ones, but you could certainly push out videos that are enormously jarring and disruptive, and they're even more so than seeing a false video of someone and still having that negative impression. You can't unwind the consequences of what happens in the community. It's hard to imagine that not happening because it's such low barriers to entry, and there'll be such easy deniability.
If I could add, there is some good news in that social media, if you watch Facebook's newsroom, they're doing takedowns nearly every week now. So they've sped that up precipitously. But we actually have the curriculum for evaluating information sources in the U.S. government. I mean, I was trained on it at the FBI Academy. They have it at the Defense Intelligence Agency, Central Intelligence Agency, which is how to evaluate information outlets. How do you evaluate expertise? They teach this. It's a unclassified, there's no secret sort of course, but it's how you adapt that into the online space. The audience I'm most worried about is actually not young people in social media. It is the older generation who's come to this technology late that doesn't really understand. They understand the way newspapers are produced, where the outlet is coming from, who the authors are. So I was with a group at New York City Media Lab, and they actually had a group of students that was, how do we help older generation who's new to social media or has less experience evaluating these sources? You can send them tips and cues. Do you know where this outlet is physically located at? That's one. Do you know who the author is, who the actual content provider is? Or can the social media company tell you? I think there are simple tools like that that we could develop, or the social media companies could develop, for all audiences, because it's not just for the young people. Young people actually have more iterations oftentimes in information evaluation digitally than their parents do. They have actually done this at times more. So I think in terms of thinking about approaches, it's about, what's the generation, what are the platforms they are on? Do they understand that places like 8chan, which are known for extremism, is based in the Philippines, and that's not really in the United States in the sense of our ability to administer these things? There are some simple tools I think we could do that are nothing more than widgets, public awareness campaigns, things that we can take from the government that we've already developed and really repackage for different audiences in the United States.
Dr. Dorman, if I could, is the technology already at the stage where good AI can produce a video that is indistinguishable from real to people with the naked eye? In other words, could AI right now fool you if you don't have access to computer analysis of whether the video is authentic?
Yes, I think there are examples out there that, if taken out of context, that if they're sent out there and there's a story or a message with it, that people will believe it. And it's not just people that have that agenda. There was a video that was out there that showed a plane flying upside down, very realistic looking, I think what people will need to do is get confirmation from other sources that something really happened. So a video in isolation, but if that's what you're talking about, a video in isolation, you're given this asking, does this look authentic or not? Independent of whether it passes the sniff test, so to speak. Yes, I think that type of technology is out there.
And it won't always be possible to disprove a video or audio by disproving the circumstances around it. In other words, if there were an audio of Dr. Wenstrup purportedly on a phone discussing a bribe, Dr. Wenstrup wouldn't be able to say that I was in this place at this time, and it couldn't have possibly been on the phone because the call could have taken place at any time. Or if there's a video of Val Demings, it won't always be possible for Val to show that she was somewhere else at the time. Do you see the technology getting to the point where, in the absence of the ability to prove externally that the video or audio is fake, that the algorithms that produce the content will be so good that the best you'll be able to do is a computer analysis that will give you a percentage? The likelihood this is a forgery is 75%, but you won't ever be able to get to 100%. Are we headed for that day where it just won't be possible to show that something we have seen or heard is illegitimate?
So part of the Metaphor program was exactly that, coming up with a quantitative scale of what manipulation or what deception is. I don't know if they've gotten there. I left partway through the program. But yes, I think there is going to be a point where we can throw absolutely everything that we have at these types of techniques, and there's still some question about whether it's authentic or not. There's no, in the case of the audio, you could do close analysis with tools and voice verification, all of those sorts of things. But just like a court of law, you're going to have one side saying one thing and you're going to have another side saying the other thing, and there's going to be cases where there's nothing definitive. I definitely believe that.
My colleagues have any further questions? Well, on that optimistic note, we'll conclude, and once again, my profound thanks for your testimony and your recommendations. The committee is adjourned.
About Mitch McConnell and the Republicans in Congress that they do not want to respond to what is so popular across the board in our country. What is it, to take it back to your question, what is it about the Republicans in Congress? How much more can they bear of the president's unethical behavior that they think that they are honoring their oath of office? And I believe these are all connected. I think it's all about money. Connect the dots in all of this. It's all about money. And look at what the president is doing in terms of Saudi Arabia and the sale of perhaps nuclear technology as well as planes to Saudi Arabia. Follow the money. Who benefits from that? To declare a national emergency that he can bypass Congress in terms of those sales, bypass the law in terms of transferring of any nuclear technology to a country. follow the money. Yes, Chan.
On this issue of a COLA increase, is there a number one problem with the idea that people come here and because the pay isn't satisfactory, they then go off Capitol Hill and go to K Street, and that entails corruption? And why is it so hard, naturally, to then take a vote on this because it's so toxic for a regular pay raise or a COLA increase? And is that appropriate at this time when people, themselves back home in the Midwest or out West need more money?
Well, it's hard at any time. It's not a pay raise, it's a COLA increase. And whether that comes to be, I don't know. It would have to be a bipartisan initiative if it were to be the case. And as you know, Mr. Hoyer feels very strongly in support of strengthening this institution, that there should be a recognition of with a COLA of the work that is done. Let me just say, listening to the members, because it's never a good time to bring up something like this, there is a sentiment in the country that Congress should not be just people who can afford to go to Congress. It should be about everybody having the opportunity. Many more women, many more people of color, and the rest. And that is where some of the unease comes from, that people say, it shouldn't be just for wealthy people. Well, it isn't just for wealthy people, but there is that impression. And there is an impression among members that it's hard to have two homes, raise a family, and all the rest. So that's part of what the discussion is. I don't see it as any, what did you say, you related to going to K Street? No, I think what I think is an issue in our country is the revolving door, largely spinning madly in the executive branch as we see it now. Look at the people in the department, the secretaries in the cabinet. They're all connected to the special interest. So many of them have left already in disgrace, dismay, or disappointment. But you see their connection, whether it's EPA, and Interior, you name the list. There's so much connection to the, when I say private sector, I don't want to paint everyone with the same brush, but to special interest. I'll paint that in there. So this whole issue of this revolving doors is a separate issue and something that has to be looked into. But as we have inclusion, and that is an important value.
The House was into 401 this morning.
Yeah.
And most people back home say, oh, Congress doesn't get any work done, nothing happens. I know you're talking about the graveyard here, but that said, the public doesn't think that Congress gets things done. And the House was into 4 o'clock in the morning. The defense markup was quite late last night as well.
No, till 7 o'clock this morning.
But what's that?
No.
But that's my point. Why does the public perceive this differently, and that's why they're opposed to a COLA increase, and members are afraid if they vote for that, they're going to get.
I don't think that this is. Look, we have a president who is ignoring the law, not honoring his oath of office, not honoring the office that he holds. We have a funding challenge that we have, which is something that must be done. By the end of the fiscal year, we must pass the appropriations bills. I'm an appropriator, left to our own devices, I believe, as I've said to you before, that the appropriators in a bipartisan way can reach solutions. We're still having the cap fight, the lifting of the debt ceiling. We have the president transferring nuclear technology as well as other weaponry to a country that is getting away with murder, and he chooses to ignore it, is engaged in a deadly war in Yemen, which the Congress opposes. So we have important policy matters to deal with. I think I've spent enough time on speculating as to whether there'll be something or not, which we don't know if there will be. Yes, ma'am.
On the appropriations, at the end of the month, the Office of Refugees and Resettlement says that they are going to run out of money to house unaccompanied migrants at the border. The Senate is going to mark up a bill next week on this issue. How do you think that the Senate and the House can bridge the divide, given the fact that they had to drop this off of the disaster aid bill just a couple of weeks ago because they couldn't find agreement?
They're working on it. There are two paths. One is in the appropriations bill where we have the Homeland Security piece, which is part of the 2020 appropriations, and then the supplemental. we'll have to have a supplemental because of the needs are so great. But I have confidence that they will come to a conclusion on it. We have to. The humanitarian needs are very great there, and we care very much about that, and we don't want them to poison pill what we're trying to do to alleviate that humanitarian challenge. I mean, really, taking children out of the arms of their mothers, separating families. How could it be, as people of faith that believe in the spark of divinity in every person, that we're all God's children, that we could treat people the way they do? But we will have to come to an agreement to get the bill passed and signed by the president.
Could it be done by the end of the month?
Oh, I think so. Yeah, I hope so. I mean, we're on that path. Yes, ma'am.
To enact legislation, you're going to have to work with this president. I don't see infrastructure on your board. Going back to the infrastructure meeting a few weeks ago, looking back, was it a good idea in that moment, right before you walked in, to accuse the president of a criminal cover-up before you were trying to get a deal done for the American public?
These are bills that have passed the House. These are bills that have passed the House. We are not giving up on infrastructure, and I say almost every day that the president is involved in a criminal cover-up. He just chose to pick it up that day. So there was nothing new about anything I said about the president at that time. I think the president just didn't want to pay for it. The purpose of that meeting was, we're going to do infrastructure, build the infrastructure of our country, which I truly believe he wants to do. Build the infrastructure of our country in a green way, I'm not sure about that, to raise the paychecks of the American worker. And to do so in a way, infrastructure is a national security issue, as President Eisenhower so beautifully demonstrated in the 50s when he instituted the interstate highway system as a national security issue to unify America. So I don't take any responsibility for the president's behavior, except to say that we're going to hold him accountable for it. Yes, sir, please.
I understand the White House is floating some offer to Democrats. They were going to review it. Have you seen that? Have you any comment on how?
I don't know what that is. What are you referencing?
Apparently, Mnuchin was in with McConnell making offers last night and wanting to run something by you. So
Well, I don't know what it is, so I can't tell you if I do, but I'll tell you where I see things. We do have to lift the budget caps, and we have to avoid sequestration, because that's not a good idea for our country. Have to avoid shutdown of government, which is palatable to some Republicans who don't believe in governance, but we will not go down that path. And we're going to combine, when we lift the caps, then we can talk about lifting the debt ceiling. But that would have to come second or simultaneous, but not before lifting the caps. I don't know what their proposal is, but I do know that we've been engaged in conversation, Mitch, and Leader McConnell and Leader Schumer and Mr. McCarthy and I, with the Secretary of the Treasury. We were making some progress, but then they kind of backed away from it. So we'll see. I don't know what that one is. I'm not usually, shall we say, when Mick Mulvaney takes the lead. Mick Mulvaney was one of the leaders in shutting down government when he was here, and voted to keep it closed. And that was when we were operating on the Republican number, that we said, we'll agree to it. We don't like it, we'll agree to it. And they didn't agree to their own number. So I'm hopeful, always open. But I think left to our own devices, we can get that. I keep using that phrase because there is bipartisanship in all of this. We know what we have to do. We can get it done. It's when they come in with deal breakers, because they don't believe in governance. They don't believe in science, which says evidence, data, truth, fact of what we need to do for our country. So if you don't accept that and you don't believe in governance, then you have a different approach to all this. Okay, are you ready for game time tonight? See my yellow jacket? Golden State Warriors. Game time.
Your bet with Justin Trudeau.
I did. Made a bet with Justin Trudeau after it was 3-1. Now, I didn't want to bring it up in Normandy. That wouldn't have been appropriate. It wasn't the time or the place. But the next day, we made our bet. Can't wait to see what those goodies are from Canada.
Poutine?
Say what? Is that what they'll have? I think that it will be, see, my advantage, apart from the Golden State Warriors, my advantage is that I'm the Speaker of the House, but my bet is from California, so walnuts and almonds and chocolate and wine. His advantage is he's the Prime Minister of Canada, so he has to have a representative supply. I don't have to do the whole country, I can just do California. So I'm eager to see what he sends. Game time. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Where it is?
Front row.
The ladies and
we're
Chad.
more than
And
happy.
Chad.